Just imagine, real stories that to this day, no one has been able to explain. These reports come from people who claim to have experienced something strange, sinister and frightening, which defies logic and leaves even the most skeptical people speechless. Today, we're going to dive into 3 such stories. Ones that are not just scary, but completely enigmatic. Reports that involve apparitions, inexplicable phenomena, and events that seem to have come straight from our worst nightmares. So get ready, turn off the lights, and put on your headphones. Because after listening to these stories, it will be difficult not to stare into the dark corners of your room. This happened when I was 18, and now, at 22, I still feel the cold of that night. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and I was a senior in high school when the world stopped. COVID hit hard and transformed everything. The schools, the places we went to, even the streets. Everything seemed to freeze in time. But ironically, it was in this scenario that my group of friends and I decided to go out even more. The city closed its doors, but we opened up the desire to explore. With almost everything closed and no safe options, our fun was seeking adventures, and in my case, exploring haunted places and forgotten corners of the city. Even today, I still feel this fascination with mystery. I may not scare easily, but I'm not naive either. I've had tense encounters with homeless people. I've come across symbols of strange sex, and I've even faced the cold barrel of a gun pointed in my direction. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what was to come that night. Around this time, I started talking more to a girl at my school called Clarissa. She shared some of my curiosity about the dark side, and only thanks to her confirming what we witnessed, my friends didn't label me crazy. We were still in a mood of recent romance, and somehow I convinced her to accompany me on an adventure, exploring a natural park in the middle of the night. It was almost 3 a.m. in San Antonio. The park is called O.P. Schnabel, a charming, even safe place when seen in daylight. But at night, it transforms into another world, dark and enigmatic. The shadows of the trees reach out like claws, and the police always watch the perimeter, keeping visitors at a distance. O.P. Schnabel carries heavy stories. In 2016, a 24-year-old woman, Lauren Bump, was brutally attacked and lost her life there, the victim of a violent attack. More recently, in 2021, a boy exploring the area was shot. It's not the kind of place you visit at night for fun. But there we were, Clarissa and I, entering the park in the dead of night, with the air heavy and a silence that seemed to amplify each step. The darkness was almost total, so thick that the trees seemed to cover any trace of moonlight. I hate using a flashlight in these places. The light only attracts unwanted attention, and I prefer my eyes to get used to the pitch black, to see beyond the obvious. We walked for about 20 minutes along the main trail. With each step, the feeling of alertness grew. My plan was not to stay long. Something was strange that night, as if the park itself was watching us. I knew of a side path that led off the trail and back to where my truck was parked, but the environment seemed intent on keeping us there. The alternative trail seemed like a good idea. I told Clarissa that we could follow it and go all the way around, avoiding the long walk back. She agreed, so we headed out onto the off-road trail. Barely 2 minutes had passed when something happened out of nowhere. A flute started playing. We stood frozen, looking at each other, trying to understand. Whoever was playing was so rhythmic that it almost sounded like a melody, but the atmosphere was not enchanting. It was pure fear. It was scary as hell. I, who am not one to scare easily, felt the chill, and Clarissa, next to me, began to shake, with panic written all over her face, to the point of almost crying. At first I was just listening, but when Clarissa began murmuring prayers, asking for protection and forgiveness, I realized the situation was serious. I tried to locate myself, understand where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be on the main trail, parallel to ours, with about 30 or 50 meters of dense forest between us, and every second made the sound get closer, as if it were on top of us. Clarissa was completely paralyzed with fear. so I knew I needed to stand my ground. I told her not to worry, that I wasn't going to let anything happen to her. I suggested we run back along the off-road trail, and she barely had time to agree before we started running. I think the flute stopped, but I was so focused on getting out of there that I didn't notice. We advanced about 9 meters when a noise took over the trail. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, and something large crossing in front of us. It could have been a deer or any other animal, but there was something strange. There seemed to be a weight, a presence, that surrounded us. I never got to see what it was, no silhouette, and I didn't hear his footsteps either approaching or moving away. I only had time to hear his noise right there in front of me, and without thinking twice, I turned and pulled Clarissa to run away in the other direction. We ran back to the point where the flute started, and then, as if something or someone was waiting for us to return, the flute started again, but this time louder, closer, reverberating around us with no clear origin. It was like a folk song, something that sounded Irish, but still had that mesmerizing, ominous rhythm. The feeling of danger became more and more palpable. The sound was all around us, with no clear direction, surrounding us as if it were a predator. The only thing left was the instinctive decision to fight or flee. With 2 options and no safe path, we were forced to decide: return to the off-road trail, where that ominous rumble had cut off our path, or return to the main trail, to where the flute, and whoever was behind it. It attracted us with its dark melody. What made off-roading even scarier was the complete darkness and dense tangle of forest, while the main trail, at least, was paved and familiar. I knew there wasn't much time to think, so I told Clarissa, still shaking, to run with me down the main trail to the truck. Fear turned our 20-minute walk into a frantic 7 or 8-minute run. At some point during this desperate rush, the sound of the flute dissolved into the silence of the night. But as we ran, we spotted a portable toilet next to the trail, and the dread returned. What if someone was there? What if, somehow, that was part of this bizarre and disturbing game? Luckily for us, we didn't see anyone, and when we reached the forest entrance, my truck was the only vehicle nearby, a sight that brought brief relief. We got in, and I stepped on the gas, leaving that place behind as quickly as I could. The next day, I told my friends everything and started searching the internet, looking for similar reports. I was surprised to see how many stories of encounters with ghosts, strange cults and mysterious animals were posted there, but no report of a flute, no macabre sound of soft, rhythmic music resounding from within a forest. I began to consider all the possibilities. Maybe there were some houses nearby, on the other side of the forest, but the sound of a flute coming from there, spreading so clearly at 3 in the morning and surrounding us like that, unlikely. It was as if that flute was floating right around us, with no obvious direction, but also no distance. I never found out who was playing the flute that night, or what that thing was that crossed our path. And the more I think about it, the more the experience seems to escape what I would call rational. It wasn't just scary, it seemed to surpass what it feels like when the mind fills in the gaps in the dark. Maybe it was something paranormal. Even today, I want to find a logical explanation for that. And although I continue to explore scary places, I never went back to that forest after sunset. On other nights of exploration, there were tense moments, but nothing that gave me that deep shiver down my spine. About me, I'm 22 years old. I work as a pharmacy technician at a hospital in northwest Alabama. I work the night shift from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. and take care of restocking the operating rooms. The job is tiring. There are 7 days in a row, but also 7 days off to compensate. My shifts run from Thursday to Wednesday, and on Tuesday, my 6th night of work, I left a little early to stay with my wife at her aunt's house, about half an hour from where we live. She was taking care of her little cousins while her aunt and uncle were traveling, but the discomfort grew every night in that house, where there were even no curtains to cover the windows. I didn't go with her right away because it was my busy work week, and she insisted that it didn't make sense for me to arrive at 5 in the morning to sleep when the sun was already rising. But on the last night she was taking care of her little cousins, The nervousness hit hard, and I assured her that I would be on my way. She is stubborn, but she admitted the relief she felt when I arrived. These 2 years of night work began to affect me in a way I didn't expect, giving me a kind of insomnia. When I arrived at her aunt's house, even though I wanted to, I couldn't sleep. Going without sleep isn't exactly new to me, but I've never been awake for more than 28 hours. The next day was still full of commitments, taking her little cousins to school, a friend's gender reveal party, shopping for home, and I still needed to be at work at 6 p.m. I fell asleep quickly, for about 10 minutes, in the car, but soon I had to face the marathon. I had a Red Bull and another energy drink when I started the shift. At this point, things were so bad that my wife was responsible for taking me to and from work, as my brakes needed urgent replacement and driving her car without sleep was just too risky. Wednesday progressed, and since 2 p.m. on Tuesday, I hadn't closed my eyes. The shift started calmly. If I could keep busy, fatigue wouldn't be an immediate problem. I put on my headphones and went to supply the operating rooms with medications, while playing some music to keep my mind active. As it was a weekday, some night surgeries were still taking place, and the cleaning staff were cleaning the rooms used. It wasn't uncommon for the surgery staff to come in suddenly to get something they needed, so whenever that happened, I turned around and waved, or smiled so as not to be awkward. I was focused, filling the Omnicell machine with medication and listening to music, when I heard the door behind me open. That sharp and clear creak typical of a door with dry hinges echoed in the silence. Soon after, I heard the muffled sound of the heavy wooden door closing, so I turned to see who it was. But there was no one. I wasn't scared right away. Maybe the person had opened the door and, upon seeing me, decided to look for another room. I moved on. But in the next room, the light was off. I opened the door, and the moment I walked in, I swear I saw someone crouched next to the Omnicell, rummaging through the sharps bin. If you don't know, this is a special bin where used needles and vials are discarded to avoid any type of accident with sharp objects. I knew they once caught someone going through the sharps bin, looking for morphine. This type of situation is taken seriously, and of course, the person was fired on the spot. I turned on the light, preparing to confront whoever was there and figure out what they were doing. But as soon as the lamps illuminated the room, I realized that no one was there. Okay. At that moment, I started to feel a chill creeping up my spine. I knew that long hours awake could cause extreme tiredness, but was it already reaching the point of hallucinations? I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that it was just sleep playing a trick on me, and I finished the job, even with that discomfort still hanging in the air. Later, I returned to the pharmacy to pick up specific medications that needed to be delivered to the nurse's station, a late-night procedure, which takes place around 2 a.m. I went up the floors, delivering the medicines one by one to the 5th floor, which, that night, was partially empty because of renovations on the 5,455 side. The patients had been moved to the 3rd floor, so that sector was temporarily unoccupied, which it brought an unusual and profound silence. Out of curiosity, and perhaps to overcome sleepiness and restlessness, I decided to go to side 5,455 and see how the works were going. The corridors were deserted, and as I crossed the sector, I felt a strange chill, as if all that silence was swallowing me. Empty patient rooms are not uncommon in renovations, but that night it felt like the silence was thicker, almost palpable. That's when I heard a noise. It felt like a bed shaking, as if someone was struggling. I followed the sound to room 5,512, and what I saw paralyzed me. There, lying on the bed, was a man, apparently having a convulsion. His body shook violently, and there was blood running from his eyes, nose and mouth. The monitor next to him was in complete despair, beeping frantically, as it does when a patient is on the verge of collapse. The hoarse sound he made sounded like a mix of gargling and groaning, so disturbing that it reminded me of the noises zombies in movies make. I stood there, watching, trying to process what was happening, and my heart just had to come out of my mouth. Instinctively, I took a step back, but quickly realized he needed help. I turned to run to the station and call someone, but when I looked back, my blood ran cold. The man was gone. Not only was he no longer in bed, but the room was spotless. The bed made, the monitor turned off, everything in perfect condition, as if no one had even entered there days ago. In that instant, the butterflies in my stomach turned into deep, real fear. It was clear that I hadn't imagined it, but how could I explain what I saw? That night, as I descended to the first floor, after what seemed like a bizarre illusion, the elevator doors opened and a man entered. As soon as he passed, he patted me on the shoulder and smiled, but his face made my blood run cold. It was the same man from the bed on the 5th floor. The man I saw convulsing and bleeding on the off monitor. He stared at me until the doors closed, and I watched him as the elevator rose again to the 5th floor. Completely terrified, I waited until the doors opened again. When the elevator returned to the 1st floor and the doors opened, it was empty. I stood there, trying to process what had happened, and ended up running to the pharmacy to wait for the shift to end. I researched online whether lack of sleep could actually cause hallucinations, and what I read only made me more nervous. Hallucinations can begin after 30 to 48 hours of being awake. I had already gone 38 hours without sleeping. It was possible that I was seeing things, but what could explain that real sensation? The touch on my shoulder. I left the hospital as soon as the shift ended and waited for my wife in the car. On the way to the parking lot, I looked out the 5th floor window and had one last shiver. The same man standing there, looking at me as if to make sure I was seeing him. I got home and collapsed from exhaustion, sleeping for hours, but it stuck in my head. About 2 weeks later, I got back to my normal routine and things seemed to get back on track. I lived with my boyfriend, Mika, in a cozy and quiet house in a safe neighborhood. He had a bachelor party in Las Vegas planned and was going away for the weekend, so I took the opportunity to have a night of wine with some friends on Friday. Amidst the laughter and horror films, we were at the height of our fun when the doorbell rang. It was one of those horror movie moments. Everyone stopped and looked without understanding. It was quite late, and that untimely sound sounded strange and threatening. I went to the door carefully, peering through the glass at the top, but I didn't see anyone. It was a surreal moment, as if someone was trying to scare us, as the 4 cars in the garage made it clear that people were home. We tried to convince ourselves that someone was playing Ding Dong Ditch, but after everyone left, the fear remained. Even though I tried to forget, that doorbell ringing at night in an empty house affected me more than I imagined. I woke up with my heart racing, the doorbell ringing incessantly. It was 1 in the morning, and the notion of someone knocking on my door at this early hour chilled me. I quickly called Mika, and he seemed completely out of it, his voice muffled by background noise that didn't sound good at all. He asked me to stay in the room and not open the door for anyone. The adrenaline kicked in, and I was unsure whether I should call the police or not. I decided to hold on to that idea for now. After hanging up, I tried to calm down, focusing on breathing to go back to sleep. But soon, I heard a click outside, then a knocking sound on my window. A man's voice called, "Hey, anyone home?" I was mentally grateful that the curtains were closed, but despair took over me. He was out there, and I had no idea who he was. When it knocked again, this feeling of invasion took me over completely. It was enough for me to decide to call the police. I had never been in a situation like this, and the idea of a stranger trying to break into my house sent me into a panic. On the phone, I whispered about the situation, asking for help, hoping they would arrive as quickly as possible. With each second, the fear grew more, and the certainty that he was still outside made me uneasy. Then the doorbell rang again, followed by a firm knock on the door. I approached, trying to remain calm, and asked who was there. The male voice replied, "It's the police." It was a different sound from the man trying to enter. I looked through the glass and confirmed that they were indeed police officers. Opening the door, the tallest police officer entered without waiting for an invitation. He looked serious and authoritative. Soon he informed me that they were responding to a call about a disturbance. I explained about the man who was lurking around the house, knocking on my window, but the officer seemed more interested in belittling me than helping. He treated me like I was overreacting, a dismissive tone in his voice that made me even more frustrated. His partner, in silence, just watched. When he started questioning me about the man's appearance, I realized he was clearly losing patience. I'd said I hadn't seen his face, but the officer persisted, as if he was just looking for a reason to ignore me. He said, "Ma'am, if you don't want our help, we can leave." I was amazed at the lack of professionalism. I apologized, explaining that I was just scared. As the two police officers moved through the house, their flashlights illuminating the rooms, the feeling of vulnerability and outrage increased. They inspected every corner, but the feeling of being discredited made me feel even more alone in those moments. I just wanted security, but their attitude was making me more apprehensive than before. The situation did not improve much after the police visit. I watched them through the window, and they mostly only gave a quick look before telling me they couldn't do anything without hard evidence. I felt a knot in my stomach as they walked away, with no reassurance or relief for my uneasiness. I wondered if the man outside had realized I'd called the police and what he might be planning next. Fortunately, when I woke up in the morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, and the feeling of a new day brought a little hope. It was Saturday, and my friend was organizing a Halloween party. I went shopping during the day, excited to help organize the party. My Velma costume, with my friend as Daphne, got me excited. I arrived at her house around 6 p.m, and the party started at 9 a.m, catching fire around 10:30 a.m. I left shortly after 1 a.m, happy and with a few beers in my head, but still able to drive. Upon arriving home, the atmosphere instantly changed. A cold draft cut through the room, and I soon realized that a window was open. What intrigued me was that I didn't remember opening it. As I went to the bathroom, I got ready to brush my teeth, but as I walked out, I noticed the basement door was wide open. A cold feeling ran through my body. A clicking sound caught my attention, and as I approached the stairs, I realized it was coming from the bottom of the basement. I froze as I reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the deep dark. The clicking stopped abruptly, and a voice echoed, "You're finally home." That was enough to make me slam the basement door shut. I grabbed my cell phone and ran to the neighbor's house. I knocked until he answered, and, amidst the adrenaline, I decided it was better to call the police from the safety of his home. This time, unfortunately, it was the same two police officers who appeared before. My neighbor accompanied me, and perhaps that made some difference in the attitude of the taller police officer, who wasn't so rude this time. They searched the house again while my neighbor and I waited in the living room. I showed the police the places I thought someone might be hiding, and while they searched the house, I had a confusing conversation on the phone with Mika, who was still drunk. I ended up turning the house upside down, looking for a sign that no one else was there. Finally, I packed my bags and decided that I would stay with my sister until Mika came home. In that moment, I learned a crucial lesson. If you have windows that are big enough for someone to sneak in, keep them locked whenever you can. Even though we continue to live in this house, I spent months avoiding being alone for long periods of time. That experience left its mark, and post-traumatic stress disorder manifested itself in frequent nightmares. Sometimes I wake up with a start, thinking I hear a knock on the window, reliving the fear I felt that terrible night.